Before we get started, I wanted to mention Jeff Mitchell's ebook, The Coldest Case, Durham's 40-year murder mystery. It's been an asset to my research. Now, keep in mind, he doesn't cover everything and he does get some details wrong, but overall, it's a better source than the Amazon Prime docuseries or some of the other content floating around out there. It's free to download, and I will provide a link in the description page. Go check it out.
I've got a lot to say, can't hold it in this time. Got no filter, I got no filter. 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 No filter, I got no filter.
In 2003, the Beverly Smith murder case would be assigned to Detective Leon Lynch, but it wouldn't be until 2005 that things started to gain traction. In March of that year, the Durham police were approached by the producers of a court TV program called Crime Files, Cold Case Edition, hosted by Sue Scambati. They were interested in featuring the case in one of their episodes, and police saw this as an opportunity to get new tips. Before Lynch would agree to the episode, he brought the subject up to Doug Smith. Doug said he was all right with it, but was concerned over the topic of drugs being the focal point. Lynch assured Doug that while questions about it would come up, it would not be the focus. While Doug being okay with it, Lynch agreed to be on the court TV show along with Beverly's twin sister Barbara and an Ontario provincial police criminal profiler. Some of the highlights included possible new evidence such as fingerprint on an ashtray, a hair fiber, and even hinted at DNA. Lynch said that the investigation would start from the beginning and follow the evidence to where it will take them. Everyone was a person of interest until excluded, except for Doug Smith. He had crossed him off the list. In fact, to quote Detective Leon Lynch, in our opinion, he's excluded from the investigation and has nothing to do with her death. Lynch hoped that someone would come forward who knew something substantial about the murder of Beverly. The criminal profiler's analysis was that Beverly was a low-risk victim, a robbery that may have ended with a murder that perhaps was not intended. The profiler recommended that the police focus on people who knew there was pot in the house. Detective Lynch sent a proposal for reopening the case to Durham homicide boss Rolf Klume. Klume looked over it, liked it, and sent the report on to his bosses. As Lynch waited for the green light, Doug Smith would make it known about his anxiousness for the police to find and arrest the murderer responsible for his wife's murder. He was stressed and worried about the effect it would have on his family, but in particular his daughter Rebecca. Doug would also have to relive everything again by giving the police another statement. He would also submit DNA, all things he complied with freely. Reliving the loss of his wife yet again clearly took a lot out of him, as I would assume would be the case for most people. Barbara would also inquire about the investigation, quite often actually. Dissatisfied with the lack of progress, it led her to take part in an Toronto Sun story in December of 2006, vowing to shame the cops into action. Finally, in May of 2007, Lynch got the go-ahead to reinvestigate Beverly's murder. He was assigned a team of investigators. He told them they would have to contact and re-interview as many of the players from 1974 as possible, which wouldn't be an easy task as they were scattered all over the country, even in the U.S. like California. Durham police officers logged many hours and thousands of miles tracking down and re-interviewing people who had given statements previously. They looked into Daigle again, but Lynch was critical with the way Turner and King determined Daigle as a suspect. He thought they were incorrect in the way they, interpreted Georgina Clue's failure to remember her 1975 statement to police as some sort of retraction. Lynch believed Daigle's alibi was ironclad and it exonerated him. Lynch did try to get Daigle to make another statement and take another polygraph test, but understandably, from what happened last time, Daigle declined. Mark Kinney was also re-interviewed in British Columbia. Mark didn't remember much that he told cops back in the 70s, and it didn't lead to anything fruitful. Summer of 2007, police interviewed Al Smith, who was now separated from Linda. Al, now an unemployed deadbeat, was now living in his daughter's basement in Coburg. Police recorded a statement from Al when they visited him, but something malfunctioned with the recording device, and they asked Al if he would come to the Durham police station for another statement, and he agreed. On July 11, 2007, Lynch and Detective Doug Parker picked up Al and drove him to Oshawa. They re-interviewed him, and after that, Lynch asked Al if he would take a polygraph test, and Al said sure. Turned out, Al Smith failed it. Detective Paul Nadeau, who conducted the test, told Al that there was no doubt in his mind that he shot Beverly. Well, this flustered Al. To summarize, Al told Paul not to make him the scapegoat after 30 years. He terminated the interview and said if they wanted to question him any further, he'll get a lawyer. Al, madder than a wet hornet, went outside of the police station to, smoke. Lynch approached Al and informed him that the failed test meant that it couldn't exclude him as a suspect, but he would still follow up on other possible leads. Still, he warned Al that the police would take a closer look at him and the version of events he told for decades. That afternoon, as Lynch and Parker were taking Al home, Al, paranoid, expressed his concern over and over about being considered a person of interest in Beverly's murder. Lynch and Parker tried to put Al's mind at ease, but he clearly wasn't having it. His thoughts were racing. They stopped at a sub shop because Parker wanted to grab some food. As Lynch and Al waited in the car, Lynch asked if they could go to Raglan because maybe it would refresh Al's memory on the events that night. Al initially was against it, but eventually he agreed. Once they got there, they drove to what was once Beverly's home. Al looked around and pointed to the window he claimed he saw Beverly's body the night she was murdered. They eventually dropped Al off at a convenience store where the deadbeat hoped to coax money out of the ATM for cigarettes. Al, still paranoid, asked Lynch and Parker to keep him updated on the investigation because he didn't want to keep chewing on his nails about it. Parker told Al not to worry, and if they needed to get a hold of him, they knew where to find him. Due to the failed polygraph test, a decision was made that evening to conduct surveillance on Al Smith. The Durham police stepped up their efforts to learn more about him and, as well, to observe him day to day. Applications for surveillance were made and granted, including wiretaps on the phone at the home of Al Smith's daughter with whom he lived. Lynch obtained records from the Peterborough facility to which Al had been admitted in 1991. They indicated that he had undergone extensive treatment and counseling for a number of issues, including a suspicion of schizophrenia. His primary concerns included anxiety and confusion, his recent and long-term memory were poor, and this is something I want you all to remember because this will be relevant in a future episode. By the time he became the subject of intense police scrutiny in 2007, Al was in his mid-50s, living on welfare, friendless, and without prospects. He was known to shuffle around the neighborhood, bumming smokes and panhandling for change. In other words, like I said before, he was a deadbeat loser. The realization that he was a suspect in the decades-old murder of Beverly Smith pressed him further into a funk. He rarely left the house. Police learned from listening to Al's daughter's phone conversation that he was suffering from intense anxiety. At one point, one of Al's sons called Linda and asked her, "Mom, just answer me point blank. Did Dad kill this lady? Because he is freaking out about it." And Linda replied, "To the best of my knowledge, I was the one who found Beverly. And that's all I know." Speaking of Linda, Al's ex-wife and now a devout Christian, things with her took an interesting turn. In August 2007, she took a polygraph test, during which she was asked similar questions those posed to Al. Well, guess what? She also failed. She was confronted by Paul Nadeau, the same officer with whom Al had squared off with earlier in the summer. He told her the test result indicated she was somehow involved in Beverly's murder. Well, naturally, Linda denied it. But Lynch now had two persons of interest instead of one. Like Al, Linda would be placed under surveillance. Let's go off course for a second. There's another interesting tidbit that I would like to speak about, especially for those who thought that poor Al was a victim of circumstance. He had two small blue dotted tattoos under his eye and by his cheek. They're also known as teardrops, a long-standing symbol among criminals who had committed murder. I mean, you could argue that those dots is for gang affiliation or his crazy life. But seeing that murder was committed across the street from him and now he is a person of interest, I'm just going to go ahead and say that the first reason seems more logical. But wait, there's more about one of the blue dotted tattoos. In November of 2007, a detective went to Alberta to interview one of Al's ex-girlfriends. Al and his ex worked at a landscaping company. One day, Al left work and didn't return until the next morning. His ex noticed the mark on his face and asked what that was about. He said it was a tattoo, and when she asked why he got it, he told her, "That's what you get when you've killed somebody." But let me guess, for all the detractors out there, he was just kidding, right? But hold on, there's more evidence. Enter Dave Maunder. Dave was a friend of Al's during the time of the murder. Dave, now living in Calgary, told police in an interview on November 16, 2007, that on the night of the murder, Al had gone to Bev's house looking to score some pot. Dave told the cops that between 6:30 and 7 p.m. he asked Al if he had any pot to sell him or if he could get him some. Al said he could try. Dave was sure of the time because he called Al before the start of his shift at the bar at 7. The next day, Dave heard about Beverly's murder, and Al just so happened to have an ounce of pot waiting for Dave, but he declined it, instead getting about a half an ounce from someone else. However, it's important to point out that Dave did have some beef with Al. He told police how he'd help Al and his brother get set up in Alberta, and you want to know the things he got in return? Al had stolen a brand new pair of jeans, and Al's brother had accepted a sizable loan from him, then stiffed him. Decent guys. So is Dave telling the truth about his conversation with Al that night of the murder and the next day, or is Dave giving Al a receipt for getting ripped off? We'll get back to that, but keep in mind, Dave didn't have to tell the police about any of those issues. He offered that up freely. He made no bones about Al Smith being a lowlife. So, the Dave Maunder interview gave the police some interesting information. Al Smith denied going over to Beverly's and Doug's house for at least a month prior to the night he found Beverly on the kitchen floor through the window. In February 2008, police listened to a phone conversation between Al and Dave. Al insisted on his innocence. Dave did mention that Al tried to score him some pot that night. Al neither confirmed or denied that on the phone conversation. Instead, he continued on ranting and raving about his innocence and how the police were out to get him. However, This topic will be brought back up later in a different episode, so let's put a pin on it. Let's get back to Linda. Now, this next part is going to be one of the most frustrating things in this case, with the exception of Beverly's murder and the June 2014 pretrial ruling, which we'll cover in a later episode. Linda is nothing short of an enigma. The police pondered whether Linda covered up for Al or if she took part in the crime. Linda started to believe that some sort of block had suppressed her memory of what had happened that night. She talked extensively with her friend and fellow devout Christian Janet Hales, which she was also living with, and another woman in the community about this problem. Linda wondered if she suffered some sort of multi-personality disorder. So, does such a condition exist that could block the memory of a traumatic event? Well, yeah, actually. There is a condition called dissociative amnesia. It occurs when a person blocks out certain events often associated with stress or trauma, leaving the person unable to remember important personal information. There are 3 different types of patterns: localized, generalized, and fugue. It is possible Linda could have fell into the localized category. For example, a crime victim may have no memory of being robbed at gunpoint, but can recall details from the rest of the day. That's localized dissociative amnesia. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying, in fact, that's what she had, but it could explain why she doesn't remember details and how she suppressed this horrific memory for over 30 years. Keep in mind, Beverly's sister asked Linda what had happened that night, and instead of giving Beverly's sister rightful answers, she didn't want to talk about it. On January 28, 2008, Detective Lynch and Detective Jennings visited Linda Smith at her home in Huron Park. The detectives told Linda that her failed polygraph test meant she knew more than what she was saying. Linda stated she was confused and that she didn't murder anyone. But Lynch told Linda that the failed polygraph test didn't mean she had to be involved but had knowledge of something. Linda insisted she wasn't hiding anything. She said Al didn't go over to Beverly's until after he discovered her on the kitchen floor. Lynch told Linda he had evidence to the contrary. Linda, bewildered, said she didn't know that. Lynch re-explained to Linda that might be why she failed the polygraph test. She might know something but didn't want to get involved. Linda explained the same narrative of what her and Al did the day leading up to Beverly's murder. They went over her story, but nothing changed. Before the detectives left, Linda agreed to do another polygraph test. After the detectives left, Janet and Linda talked about what was going on. Linda questioned if Al was really with Linda the entire night due to the evidence they had. This would be a topic of discussion for the next several days, and with Janet pressing Linda on it. And at one point, Janet made it clear to Linda that if she ever found out she was lying about anything, she would be kicked out of the house. In the early months of 2008, the police interrogated Linda. She kept with the same story, but in February, things started to change. Linda pondered that if Al was innocent, then why was he freaking out so much? Linda asked Detective Jennings if she really thought Al did this, and Jennings acknowledged that yes, she did. Linda dreadfully contemplated, wow, I've been living with a murderer all these years. Jennings told Linda it was time to tell them everything she knew, but Linda still persisted she didn't know anything. Jennings then told Linda about what Dave Maunder had told them. Linda was shocked, her mind completely blown by the new revelation. Later in the interrogation, Linda went from saying Al never left her side to, well, maybe for a few minutes, and then, well, maybe up to an hour. Detective Lynch eventually joined the interview, and Linda started to give a new story of what she remembered that night. Linda remembered she was in the middle of making formula for her daughter when she heard a noise that sounded like backfire from a car. Despite the loud noise, she didn't inspect further as she was busy taking care of her baby. Lynch was skeptical of Linda's story, but he inquired further. Lynch asked where the noise came from, and Linda told him from across the street, specifically from Doug and Beverly's place. Linda didn't think it was important at the time because she thought it was just a car or truck going by. Lynch asked where Al was at the time, but Linda didn't know. As the interview went on, Linda questioned more things that she took for granted, such as Al's actions at night, such as why did she have memory of him saying Beverly's injuries was much more than a bump on the head? Why would he rush to park his Humane Society van in Beverly's driveway? Why did the police question him so extensively on the night of the murder? Later, Lynch asked Linda if Dave Maunder called earlier and she agreed. She said he called Al to get some pot for him. Lynch asked where Al could have got it from, and she assumed Doug from across the street. A few days later, Detective Lynch questioned Al again about the night Beverly was murdered. Al said he and Linda might have made a few trips back and forth between their house and Beverly's. Lynch responded that Linda didn't remember ever going over there with him, just when she went over to check on Beverly for her husband Doug. Al's only retort was that people need to take another look at what they're doing. The police compiled what they considered compelling evidence, and on March 17, 2008, Al Smith was arrested in Coburg at the home of his daughter for second-degree murder of Beverly Smith. But that wouldn't be the only arrest. Linda was arrested for obstructing police. I wish I could say this case was close to coming to an end. I wish I could tell you that both were eventually taken to trial, convicted for their roles, but sadly, there's some unfortunate twists ahead. In the next episode, you're going to learn more as to why Al isn't the decent man he claimed, be it in the courtroom or outside of it. What wasn't told by Amazon Prime's docuseries and these true crime content creators will shock you, and it should make you rethink anything you know about this case. You're also going to learn more about how frustrating Linda is as a person as she continued to change her story, complicating this case. Is she confused? Is she mentally ill? Is she a liar? Or is it a mix of some or all of the above? You'll find that out in the next episode. Until next time.